Hi, this is Chuck Stull looking at change in the telecommunications industry. Today's telecommunications world looks very different than where we ended last time. So we looked at AT&T, a technologically innovative company that was vertically integrated, regulated by both state and federal agencies, and a complete monopoly across all the different industry sectors. Now, that is not the world of telephone communications today. So I'd like to look at is um, what caused structural change in the telecommunications industry. And it really had two components. One was a series of antitrust cases, both brought by the Department of Justice and by private litigants. Now, the early cases were settled by agreements with essentially very minor conduct changes. We will return to a major Section 2 case that had big, important structural changes towards the end of this video. But there were also some important rule changes by the Federal Communications Commissions. And initially, these were more important um, given the heavily regulated environment. So the first set of cases, the Federal Communications Commission allowed competing manufacturers' equipment to be connected to the Bell network. The first case came in 1956, what is known as the Hushaphone case. So this was a plastic attachment that had attached to a telephone mouthpiece to reduce background noise. Its function was very simple. It was a lot like cupping your hand around the mouthpiece in order to reduce external noise. There were no electronics. It was just a hollow piece of plastic. Now, AT&T tried to prevent its use, tried to make this illegal, and initially the Federal Communications Commission agreed. It went to court and they overturned the FCC decision, and the FCC then allowed the Hushaphone equipment to be attached because it did no harm to the network. So, very simple device. In 1968, Carterfone looked to connect a telephone to a radio, essentially to make a speakerphone. And so the handset would just sit inside this coupler. There'd be a microphone and a speaker, and it would transmit without having any real permanent connection to the phone network. And again, this was something that AT&T wanted to prohibit, but the FCC allowed it and allowed any lawful device. Now, those decisions, while they seem so minor, really set the stage for all of the kinds of equipment that we now can connect to the telephone system. So answering machines, later faxes, computer modems, and it also eventually led to us being able to purchase our telephones at Walmart and so forth. The second important set of decisions were long-distance competition. So the Federal Communications Commission gradually allowed entry into the long-distance market. Long distance wasn't the same kind of natural monopoly. And there was a new technology, microwave transmission, that didn't require wires, and that's what MCI initially stood for, and the FCC approved service in 1969. Sprint, which had its origins in those rural independent phone companies, one particularly in Kansas known as Brown Telephone, and Sprint was initially able to offer long distance in Kansas, but by the 1980s it was widespread. Now, initially these companies had very small market shares, but they were immensely important in establishing the idea that monopoly was not necessary in the phone industry. Right? Something of a revolutionary idea for its time. And this became very influential for policymakers. Now, the other really big change here was a major Section 2 monopolization case. against AT&T. It accused AT&T of monopolizing long-distance service, customer premise equipment, and network equipment. Essentially, they were accused of using their local monopoly power to expand a monopoly into all segments of the U.S. phone industry. Now, this case was filed in 1974, and like other Section 2 cases, it was a very long and expensive case. In the early 80s, Judge Green ruled that AT&T probably had violated Section 2, and AT&T then sought to negotiate a settlement. And in 1982, what was known as the Modified Final Judgment was an agreement to break AT&T up into independent companies. So similar to the Standard Oil cases or the American Tobacco case, where large dominant companies were divested or separated into individual competing companies. So AT&T was broken into 8 pieces. So there was the part that remained is AT&T, and then the 7 regional Bell operating companies, sometimes known as the Baby Bells. Now, AT&T kept the crown jewels. They had the very profitable long-distance service. They had Bell Labs, that world-class research organization, the inventor of the transistor, that fount of innovation with its Nobel Prize-winning scientists. They had Western Electric, the company who had expertise in manufacturing phones, electronics, and network systems, and they had an architecturally renowned New York headquarters. This was seen as the real winning component of the breakup. Now, the regional Bell operating companies, or RBOCs, or the Baby Bells, were geographically divided. And so we had NYNEX for New York and New England. We had US West, headquartered in Denver, Bell South, headquartered in Atlanta, Ameritech, headquartered in Chicago, Bell Atlantic, headquartered in Philadelphia, Pacific Telesis, or Pac Bell, headquartered in San Francisco, and very importantly, Southwestern Bell, headquartered in Dallas. Now, these were seen as plain old telephone service, just the local companies, nothing flashy, no Nobel laureates, just a boring day-to-day business. These weren't seen as the important components of the breakup. AT&T was seen as the real, expected to be the real winner. Now, the public was very concerned. Their fear was that the phone system would stop functioning on the day of the breakup. And this was really a widespread concern at that time. But in terms of that concern, the actual outcome was that the quality of the services stayed high. Prices of long-distance services fell substantially as there was more competition there, and we started to see more and more innovative products. Now, if we look at long distance, we went from a complete Bell monopoly to then Bell with these tiny fringe firms who had a very small percentage of the market, to what became a tight oligopoly, where Bell had about 60%, MCI had about 25%, and Sprint had about 10% market shares. Right, this is in the 1990s, and prices stabilized after significant drops. Now, in the 2000s, entry by the regional Bell operating companies took a lot of AT&T's share away, and the profits in the long-distance services fell dramatically. And that really hurt AT&T. More broadly, AT&T had trouble adjusting to competitive markets. While it was seen as the best of those companies, it really struggled as a business. It laid off tens of thousands of employees. They had all kinds of different restructurings and plant closings. Bell Labs was spun off. as Lucent Technologies in 1996, which was purchased by French firm Alcatel, who then sold it in 2015 to Nokia, the Finnish phone manufacturer. So AT&T really went through hard times. Now, the regional bell operating companies did very well, showing the power of monopoly. Those local bells, seen as nothing more than just keeping the system running, right, turned out to be very, very powerful. And again, this is shows the power of monopoly. When you have no competitors, you can do very well. Now, in the 1990s, there was concern about this monopoly power, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was very concerned about monopoly in local phone markets. Again, this was an era when they were considering landlines as the real area to worry about. And they said that if the RBOCs, if the baby bells opened the local markets to competition, they would allow the regional bell operating companies, the baby bells, to sell long distance service once their own local markets were sufficiently open to competition. And this turns out to be a really important change. And to some extent leads to the next set of structural change we'll talk about in our next video. This has been Chuck Stahl talking about structural change in telecommunications, part 1. Thanks for listening.